everybody, it's Lori again, and welcome back to my kitchen. Today I'm pretty excited to be able to share my mom's recipe for home canned pickled beets. As far back as I can remember, when I was a little girl, I would get so excited to see my mom bringing up a jar out of storage of her home canned pickled beets. I've always loved them. It's probably a really weird thing for a child to like, but I've always loved them, and I still love them as an adult. And I'm just really super excited to be able to share her recipe with you today. So I'm going to get right started and tell you what you need. You're going to need some raw beets. You will also need some apple cider vinegar and water, sugar, ground cloves, ground allspice, and ground cinnamon. It's a pretty simple brine to make. And what we're going to do first of all is we're going to start by cooking our beets. Now, you cook your beets beforehand so that you can easily skin them. The skins slide right off. And after I get my beets cooked, I'll show you how easy it is to get the skins off of the beets. But I'll page down just a little bit right now so you can see what I have going on the stove. And this was a gift from a friend. She had some extra, they're commercially grown and harvested beets. And she had a great big bag of them. And so she asked me if I could use some. And I said, absolutely. So these are commercially grown beets. Now, if I was using my own beets from the garden, which I've already canned all of my own beets up yet, from this year. But if I was using my own beets, I like to leave about 2 or 3 inches of the stems on top, and I also try to keep that root intact if possible when I'm pulling them from the ground and harvesting them from the garden. And what that does is it just kind of helps retain the color of the beets. Now, it's not a big deal to not have the root. Here I am talking to you, and you can't even see. I'm sorry. Sometimes I get distracted talking to y'all, and I have a squirrel moment. So this is another one of those squirrel moments. So if I'm harvesting my beets in the garden, I do try to very carefully pull them from the ground to hopefully keep that root intact. Now, if your root breaks off, that's not the end of the world. It's not really even that big of a deal. But if you can keep the root intact, and also when you're cutting off the beet greens, the beet tops, which, by the way, are marvelous to eat, cook those beet tops up, and they're fantastic. But anyway, that's not the point either. When you cut the beet greens off the top of your beet, try to leave about 2 or 3 inches of beet stems on there. And what that does is that really helps the beets as they're cooking. It helps them to maintain their color. The color doesn't all bleed out of the beet, and they don't get all bleached out looking. So, but what I'm working with today is commercially grown and harvested beets. And so now I will page down and I'll show you what I'm doing. And what I've got going on here is I have, because these are commercially harvested beets, they were all just thrown into this bag, all sorts of different sizes. When you grow them in the garden, generally beets grow pretty uniform in size, but these were just kind of all over the spectrum of sizes. And so what I have going on is I have some of my bigger beets in one pot, and then my smaller beets in another pot. And you can see that there is a pretty big size difference. And the reason why I'm separating them into 2 pots is because the little beets, if they were in with the big beets, the little beets are going to get cooked much quicker than the larger beets. The larger beets are going to need a little bit longer of a boil to cook than the smaller ones are. So I did take the time to separate them today. You might not have to do that with like your homegrown beets, but these, you just kind of, I guess you just kind of figure out things and you modify things in your particular situation. So today I separated them into 2 separate sizes and 2 separate pots. Now all I'm going to do is I'm going to bring these to a boil, and then I'll lower the heat a little bit to a low boil or a simmer, and I'm going to cook them for, probably I'm going to estimate around 20 minutes, okay? But that is a give or a take also because it depends on the size of your particular beets, okay? And what I'm looking for is when they are properly cooked, I'm going to be able to stick them or pierce them with a fork. You know how you test like a potato to see if it's done inside by sticking it with a fork? Same thing for beets. We're just going to simmer these or low boil them until they are soft enough that I can pierce them with a fork. And then I'll show you how easy they are to peel. Now that's another thing I didn't mention. These are just washed and scrubbed up well. You don't peel them when they're raw. I peel them after I have cooked them, and we'll just dunk them in a sink of cold water, and those skins, those peelings are going to slip right off, just like if you were blanching a tomato. So right now I'm going to get my heat started, and we'll bring these to a boil, lower it to a simmer or a low boil, and just cook them until they are soft enough to stick with a fork, and then I'll be back. All right, so we are over at the sink. My beets are have now been simmered or boiled until they were soft when I stuck them with a fork. So now all I'm going to do is I'm going to drain them into the sink, and then I'm going to fill my sink with cold water. This is how I always drain my stuff. I don't know why, it's just a little bit easier for me, but unlike when I'm removing a lid, I drain my big pans towards me. And yes, it is a little bit steamy, but I can control it a little bit better this way. All right, so we have our beets in the sink. And now all I'm going to do is just plug my sink and just allow it to fill up with cold water. All right, so I'll be back in just a second when I've got the sink filled with water. All right, so my beets are now covered in cold water, and my dog's going to go off. All you do is you just take your beets, and these skins will just slide right off in your hand, okay? Look at how simple this is. Just so very, very easy. So I just remove all the skin. I pinch off the roots. If you need, you can take a little knife and just do a little extra, pruning on them or whatever. And then I'm just going to cut them. You can kind of see here, it's hard for me to move my camera or anything right now because I have wet hands. But you can see that I have my bowl of the small beets were done first. And so I got them all peeled and sliced and put in a bowl. And so now I'm just going to add my larger beets to it. And I just peel and just slice as I go into a stainless steel bowl. Of course, with beets, you want to make sure that you don't use something that is going to be easily stained, like a, plastic bowl or something like that. Because you know how beet juice is. Beet juice is just, it'll just stain just about anything. If you have any problems removing anything, just take your knife and just kind of slide it off. And you can cut your beets into chunks if you prefer. I'm going to slice these this time, but I do often do beet pickles in just chunks. Whatever you want your beets to look like, your beet pickles to look like, you just slice them however you want. If they're really, really small ones, you could also even leave them whole for your beet pickles. So this is how easy it is. These skins just literally slide right off in your hand, no effort whatsoever, and you have a completely beautiful peeled beet. All right, I'll do one more here. Just put a little pressure with your hands, your thumbs, and go around the beet, and it'll just slide right off. Perfect every time. Got a little something there that I want off, and then slice them into my finished bowl. All right, so I am going to continue peeling and slicing my beets, and then I'll meet you back over at the stove in a few minutes. So my beets are cooked, peeled, and sliced, or like I said, if you want to chunk yours, or if they're small enough, you want to leave them whole, whatever shape you want to have them in is absolutely fine. I sliced all of mine. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create our brine. And the brine calls for 2 cups of apple cider vinegar, 2 cups of water, 2 cups of sugar. I've got to check my recipe on my spices here. 1 teaspoon of cloves, but I always do half of that because cloves can become really overpowering in pickle recipes. So even though my mom said 1 teaspoon of cloves, she always scanted it too. I don't know why the recipe is still written in its original form, but I'm going to change that to 1/2 teaspoon of cloves. And this is ground cloves. 1 teaspoon of ground allspice and 1 tablespoon of cinnamon. Now that single recipe of brine should cover approximately 5 to 8 pounds of beets. Now I have approximately 15 pounds of beets, and so I'm going to do a double recipe. And since I don't have a non-reactive pot that's big enough, I'm splitting that double recipe into 2 different pans, okay? So I have a recipe and a half in one and a recipe and a half in the other. And so I've done my apple cider vinegar and my water in both pans. And so I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to add my sugar, which for a single recipe is 2 cups. And since I have a recipe and a half, I'm going to put 3 cups of sugar in each pan. Now, like I said, you know, this is all part of like modifying and adapting to your particular situation. I didn't have exactly 5 to 8 pounds of beets. I have a lot more beets than that. So I'm just going with the flow and making it work. All right, now our cloves, we already decided that we're going to scant that and we're going to say 1/2 teaspoon in each recipe. So I'm going to do 1/2 teaspoon for the one recipe and just 1/4 teaspoon for the recipe and a half. So that could have technically been 3/4 teaspoon had I thought about it quicker, but that's okay. I'll do about 3/4 teaspoon in this one. All right, and then the nutmeg. Nutmeg, you don't have to scant that at all. So our nutmeg, we have 1 teaspoon per recipe, and since I have a recipe and a half, I'm going to do 1 1/2 in each pan. And then on to our cinnamon. And honestly, cinnamon, I personally do not feel like you can ever overdo cinnamon, okay? So a single recipe calls for 1 tablespoon. I'm going to do a good tablespoon and a half, and if it's a little bit more than that, I'm not going to worry about that at all. Cinnamon is just a wonderful spice, in my opinion. There we are. Okay, so now all we're going to do is we're going to stir these up really good, and we're going to bring them to a boil. And after I get it to a boil, I'll come right back. So I have brought my brine to a boil, and then I lowered the heat, and I've simmered it for 5 minutes. Now this is the time that I want to take my prepared jars, and I want to heat them, because when we go to pack our sweet beet pickles into our jars, they're going to be hot. So we want hot jars also in order to avoid thermal shock. So what I do is I take my prepared jars and I put them into my cold oven. And then I set it for 220 and turn it on so that the jars and the oven all heat up together. So you're not going to have thermal shock with those jars going into a hot oven. It's a cold oven. 220 degrees, and then I just push go, and it will preheat up to 220 degrees with my jars in there. So now to my brine that I have simmered for 5 minutes, I'm going to add my cooked and cut beets into the brine, and I'm going to simmer them for about 10 or 15 minutes just so that they really get infused with this wonderful brine. And I honestly wish that there was smell-o-vision, because this brine just smells amazing. So I'm just going to divide my beets, and very carefully, because you are working with hot brine, you don't want anything plopping in really hard into your pan and, you know, flopping up and splatting at you. So I'm just going to very carefully add my beets and divide them between the two pans. All right. And then I'm going to find a plastic spoon. If you only have metal spoons, I want you to be really careful when you're stirring this, because you can really gouge and break apart your beets, okay? So I'm just going to take a large plastic cooking spoon and just make sure all of your beets are down in the brine. I think I might have overloaded this one pan. I'm going to put a little over into this other one. This is all part of that adaptive stuff, you know? You just do what works. All right, now I'm happier with the level of beets in each one of my pans. All right, so now I'm going to bring this back up. You know, my beets are kind of cool, so you know, or at least they're at room temperature. So putting them in my hot brine has lowered the temperature. I'm going to bring all of this back up to a simmer, and I'm going to simmer for 10 or 15 minutes. And in that time, my jars are getting heated in the oven, and in about 10 or 15 minutes, we'll be packing sweet beet pickles into our jars. So we'll be back really shortly. All right, when I told you to get your jars prepared, I failed to tell you this is the time that you want to get your canner ready also. Pickled beets are just a simple hot water bath. You can also go ahead and open kettle can them, but I personally do prefer to hot water bath my pickled beets. Pickled beets aren't something that I'm absolutely insisting on trying to get crispy, crunchy pickles. Pickled beets are firm, but they're not crunchy by any means. So I just prefer to hot water bath mine. So I am going to be using my PC as a steam canner. Well, there, my jars inside the oven are hot. I'm going to be using my stovetop PC as a steam canner. I have a video on how to do that also if you want to look that up. So I'm not pressure canning these. I'm just using my stovetop pressure canner as a steam canner. And steam canning is the exact same as hot water bathing. And you also use the water bath time. So I've rearranged my stove just a little bit. You can see my beets are still behind my canner, but I had to kind of jig-jag everything around so it would all fit. So I'm heating up my canner along with simmering my beets in the brine for 10 to 15 minutes. All right, so now we'll be back in a little bit. All right, the beets have simmered in the brine for about 15 minutes. My canner is hot. My jars are hot. We're ready to load our jars with the pickled beets. So I'm going to aim down so you can see what I'm doing. And it is just as simple, pretty much as any other process. Get you down where you can see there. Sorry, I'm having technical difficulties tonight. All right, so I'm going to take a pan of hot prepared jars out of the oven. Now, you can get your jars hot any way you want to, okay? If you would prefer to boil your jars, that's absolutely fine. I have no problem with that. I just find the oven a little bit easier, personally. So, all we're going to do is we're just going to take our simmered beets and ladle them into our jars. Kind of settle them down in there just a little bit. I will also sometimes just gently press them down with my spoon. And since my jars are hot, I kind of like to load all of my jars with beets right away. And then I come back and I add my brine. Just because I want them to stay hot. And once I put my hot beans into the hot jar, or hot beets into the hot jar, the beets are going to help keep that jar hot until I get the brine in there. Just kind of rattle them around and settle them down a little bit. You can do this in wide mouth or regular mouth jars. Doesn't matter. Just get your beets to approximately 1-inch headspace. All right, so that's all I will do for now, just so the video doesn't get too long. And then what I do is I go back and ladle in my hot pickling brine that they have been simmered in. And you just ladle that brine in to the same 1-inch headspace. All right. Since I am steam canning these, I do not have to heat the lids and rings. Now you can debubble your jars. A lot of people suggest that you do that. It's actually a very good canning practice. I will admit that I'm one of those people. I'm really terrible. I don't debubble a whole lot of anything anymore, and I don't have any issues at all with overflow problems or jar failures or any of that type of stuff. I'll turn this down. I have multiple things going on here at once, so you'll have to excuse me that my my verbal commentary is not going that smoothly tonight. All right, so I have wiped those rims, and then we are going to place our clean flats. And now remember that these jars are really, really hot. All right, so when you go to screw on those bands, you're probably going to want to have a hot pad on to support the jar. And then right into the hot canner they go, okay? Fingertip tight, just like any other canning project. And we are going to hot water bath or steam can these for 20 minutes. All right, so I am going to finish getting all of my beets packed into my jars and into the canner. I'm going to steam bath. You can hot water bath if you would like for 20 minutes. And then I will come back when they have completed canning, cooling off and sealing, and I'll show you the finished project. So I'll see you in a bit. All right, so I have successfully steam canned all of my sweet pickled beets, and now they are out of the canner and I am allowing them to cool and seal. You might hear one or two of them pop as I'm recording here. But on top of it, I had approximately 15 pounds of beets. And I have 5, 10, 15, I have 16 pints of finished pickled beets. And I did do a double recipe. You know, I did a recipe and a half in each one of my my pots. And so I technically did a double recipe of brine. So a double recipe of brine completely covered 15 pounds of beets. Plus, I had just a bit left over. I had about a quart and maybe a quarter left of brine. Now, I am saving this beet brine because I'm going to steam boil some eggs and make pickled beet eggs using this brine. So I'll put that in the refrigerator tonight and do that project tomorrow. But as these cool and seal, I do have a pint of sweet pickled beets that I prepared a couple of weeks ago with the beets from our garden. Now I said, you know, the beets from our garden, we only had, I think that I got maybe, I don't know, 12 or 13 pints maybe out of our garden this year. And all of these beets that I prepared tonight were a gift from another friend. But these are what I pickled just a couple of weeks ago. So I want to go ahead and I want to open that jar for you so that you can see for yourself what the consistency of these beets are. Now you can tell these ones I chunked. I did not slice them in slices. I actually chunked them because they were larger beets. But look at that. These are very solid. They're not mushy at all. They're very solid beets. But I'll page up here. Because y'all know that, you know, you might as well put your money where your mouth is, right? These are fantastic, I'm telling you. Oh, so good. With the apple cider vinegar, it's a little bit more toned down than if you would use white vinegar. There's plenty of sweetness in there, but it is not overbearing. And the spices, the cinnamon and the allspice, and did you hear that beautiful sound? Ping, ping, ping. With the cinnamon and the allspice and just the tiny touch of cloves. Now remember, I scanted the cloves, and I always scant the cloves in this recipe. They're just absolutely wonderful. I could seriously stand here and probably shamelessly just eat this whole pint of pickled beets right in front of you guys. I love these things. So delicious. Anyway, I will try to finish swallowing here. Anyway, these are another one of my very favorite things. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, This particular recipe is my mother's recipe that has been handed down to me, and I've been canning this for years also. They're just a special treat in our home, and I hope that maybe some of the things that I showed you during this video are helpful to you, especially, you know, the cooking and peeling part. Even if you're going to just can just plain beets, that would be what you do, is you boil your beets, you boil your raw beets, and then you put them into a sink of cold water and you just slip those skins right off. And that would be what you also do just to can plain beets. But I think these are just so very special. They're just a treat to me, and they're a wonderful little special side dish, you know, for any meal realistically. So anyway, I hope that you enjoyed it, and a special call out and thank you to my mom, who taught me so much and shared so much with me, and I am blessed and grateful and thankful for her, and that I can share this with you today. Happy canning, everybody.